Welcome back. In this lesson we're going to be looking at the Sunnah elements of the prayer. So we've covered the integrals, which is the bare-bones structure. We've covered the necessary actions, which is to give it some structure, give it flesh, give it skin. And now we're going to look at the Sunnahs, which is adorning it with beautiful clothes. Now the Sunnah elements are very important to do in the prayer. If you don't do them, there's no worldly consequence in the sense that you have to make up your prayers again, but there could be an otherworldly consequence in that to repeatedly emphasize sunnahs is a point of sin, and it also implies to turn away from the sunnah, right? Rasulullah came to give us something, and everything he gave us there's a benefit in, and if someone repeatedly turns away from the sunnah, then it becomes problematic. And the sunnah has a nur. Every action in the deen has a specific nur, a light attached to it, and a point of spirituality. And to perform the sunnah actions, to go the extra mile and perform the sunnah actions, which are the actions going back to Rasulullah, the way he adorned and beautified the prayer, it's a huge point of return for us in our spiritual growth within the religion. So our author starts with, amongst them are the following. So he's going to list the sunnahs now, and he says amongst them are the following, which means that the list is actually larger than what he has given us. So we're going to go through his list, and then at the end we're going to add some additional sunnahs from some other books. So in the integrals of prayer, for the tahrima, to raise the hands parallel to the ears, except for the free woman, who is to raise her hands parallel to her shoulders. Now some things are done differently for men and some are done differently for women. Some of them, we're going to discuss both of them as we go along, but then at the end I've compiled a list of what specifically needs to be done for women if they're not going to be covered here. So for the tahrima, to raise the hands parallel to the ears, so the men raise their hands here. The men raise their hands up to here. They can even touch their ears if they want, but then they raise their hands up to their ears, and they don't do this to their hands. They keep their hands like a natural pose of the hands, and then they say Allahu Akbar. To say Allahu Akbar after the hands are raised. So the dominant opinion is that you get here before you say Allahu Akbar. Sometimes you hear people say Allahu Akbar. You get your hands up to your ears before you say Allahu Akbar. To keep the fingers outspread when doing so, as we just mentioned. Palms facing the Qibla. Sometimes people do this, right? To face the Qibla is the sunnah. To keep the head straight and not down. Sometimes people look down when they say Allahu Akbar. To keep the head straight, Allahu Akbar. And thumbs touching the earlobes. And now women, they only raise their hands up to here. It's more befitting their modesty that they raise their hands only up to here, up to the height of the shoulders. For the man to place the right hand over his left hand under the navel. So a man would put his right hand over his left hand, and he would do this, right? So he would do something like this, and he would place it just below his navel for all rakas. Whereas a woman will put her right hand over her left hand, and she would put her hands over her chest like this. Also for a man, it's important that he doesn't, when he says the Allahu Akbar, he doesn't hold on to his garments. A woman would do this, but a man wouldn't do this. A man wouldn't do this and say Allahu Akbar. This is a loose garment, and certain jalabiyas and thawbs are very loose. The Egyptian ones, the Sudanese ones, the Maghribi ones are very, very loose. And men do not do this, right? They let their arms show when they say Allahu Akbar. Whereas a woman, naturally, she would do this, because then that would entail exposing her modesty, and depending on how much is exposed for how long, it could invalidate her prayer. To recite the opening supplication of the prayer. So this is known as Thana, the opening dua, it's the opening supplication when we start our prayer. It's from the Sunnah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, wa tabarak asmuk, wa ta'ala jadduk, wa la ilaha ghayruk. To recite the ta'awudh once in the prayer for the one reciting the Quran, i.e. not the follower in congregation. If you're in a congregation, this is the job of the imam. Because he's going to recite the Quran, so he's going to seek refuge in Allah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. You don't do this. You have to basically keep silent and follow him in his recitation. He is the one that recites this. If, however, you're a latecomer and you've missed certain cycles of prayer, right, then when he gives his final salams and you stand up to make up for your third cycle or fourth cycle or second cycle, in that instance you now are reciting Quran by yourself. So in this instance you would then say the A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajim. To recite the Basmala, which is the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, before the Fatiha in every unit except for the follower. So in every cycle where you're going to recite the Surah Fatiha, to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Again, if you're a follower, you wouldn't do this, because you would just rise and you would stay zipped, stay silent, and the Imam would be doing all the recitation for you. Number 7, to silently say Ameen after the Fatiha, as well as Rabbana Lakal Hamd after rising from ruku. Now, when we go through the description of the entire prayer, we'll mention these things in more detail, but to silently say Ameen. So we don't say a lengthy Ameen. No, the Imam and the congregation, or even if you're playing even if you're praying alone by yourself, to say Ameen, so only you can hear it. Number 8, for the Imam to recite the takbirat out loud. So when you're following the Imam, when he needs to go into the bowing position, when he needs to go into the ruku position, the sujood position, and when he needs to come back up again, to say the Allahu Akbar with sufficient audible voice that people can hear him. Now, not to say it exaggeratingly loud for a tiny congregation, and not to say it in a very meek voice, but to say it in a balanced voice so that everybody can hear him and then they follow his actions. Because as you know, if you're in a congregation, then the people at the back may not be able to hear what's happening up front. To recite the takbirat of going into ruku and sujood, as well as when rising from sujood. When the Imam is going into any act, when he goes into ruku, when he goes into sujood, to recite the takbirat, to say Allahu Akbar, and to say it at the time of performing the action, not to say it after he's gone into the action. Sometimes you see in the mosques where the Imam has completely done the action, and then he says Allahu Akbar, and then everybody follow him. And then when he goes down into sujood, he's completely gone down, and when he's close to his forehead touching the ground, he says Allahu Akbar, and then the congregation follows him. He is supposed to say that during the action, Allahu Akbar, like this, right? Not when he's completed the action or he's about to complete the action. The idea is to fill all your movements, even the empty spaces between your movements, to fill them with the words of Allah. To recite the Tasbih 3 times in both ruku and sujood. This is when you say Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim, and Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. To recite the Tasbih 3 times in both ruku and sujood. This is when you say Subhana Rabbiyal A'la, Subhana Rabbiyal A'la, Subhana Rabbiyal Azim. To recite these 3 times. The minimum is to recite them 3 times. If you recite them less than 3 times, it's considered disliked. The minimum recitation is 3 times. You can do it 5 times or 7 times. And it's a beautiful moment when you connect with your Lord. When you're in sujood and then you're praising your Lord like this, it's natural to carry on past the 3rd time, to enjoy the moment, to be in a state of utter humility and at peace and in awe of your Lord, and to know that your Lord is watching you and you're prostrating to your Lord. It's a natural thing to carry on past 3 times and to say it 5 times and to savor the moment, or 7 times to savor the moment. To recite the Fatiha in the last 2 units of a 4-unit prayer and in the 3rd unit of Maghrib. Now the Fatiha, as mentioned in the previous lesson, is wajib. To recite the Fatiha is wajib. You don't need to recite the Fatiha if it's a obligatory element of the prayer, then it's 1 verse of the Quran, as we mentioned, just 1 verse. The necessary action is to recite the Fatiha, and the Sunnah is to recite them in the 3rd and 4th cycles. Right? It's a Sunnah in the 3rd and 4th cycles, and not a wajib, and in the 3rd cycle of your Maghrib prayer. So we'll look at this as we do the complete prayer, inshallah. To send blessings on Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the final sitting. This is also a Sunnah, and we shall be looking at the actual wordings for this when we go through the complete prayer together. Number 13, to make a final supplication dua afterwards using words that do not resemble normal human speech. So this is to, after the Sunnah of sending salawat upon Prophet ﷺ, you would make a final dua, and this dua needs to be either words from the Quran or from the Hadith, and not a supplication of where you could ask somebody in real life for something. For example, oh Allah, fix my car. Oh Allah, fix my phone. Fix my laptop. These are things that you can ask somebody in the real world to do. So you wouldn't be using this as words of dua. You would rather be asking Allah for forgiveness. Oh Allah, forgive me. Oh Allah, enter me to Jannah. Oh Allah, make me strong in the religion. Things like this. And there are ample du'as from the Sunnah that cover this beautifully. Number 14, to turn one head right and left when making the closing salams. So to turn your head completely, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And then to utter the sunnah part of it is not just to say Assalam, Assalam, which was the necessary element. Here it's to complete Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. To utter it like that completely is from the sunnah. And to intend to be greeting the imam, if he happens to be on your right or left, and to greet the congregation, and to greet the angels, and to greet everybody basically when making this. Right, now here are some of the other points from the sunnah. As I mentioned, we'd add to keep feet 4 fingers apart. So to keep, if your feet are here, right, to have like a gap of like 4 fingers between your feet, it's closer to humility to stand like that. To lengthen the first rak'ah of Fajr, to make your first rak'ah of Fajr longer than your second rak'ah, to balance them out equally if it's any other prayer. Hands on thigh, fingers parallel to knees without grabbing the knees. So when you go into ruku, to keep your hands on your thighs. This is for sitting. So this is when you sit. So when you sit, your hands are on your thighs. Your hands are not on your knees. Your hands are on your thighs. And your fingers are parallel to your knees, and they're slightly spread. Right? They're slightly spread. They're not like this. They're not like this. They're just relaxed in a natural pose. Pointing with finger while reciting the testification of faith. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So when you recite, again when we do the complete prayer, we'll mention this, is to raise your finger. For the imam to pronounce the second salam less audibly than the first. So when the imam pronounces the first salam, it's louder than the second salam. For the latecomer to wait until the imam says the second salam to see if he needs to perform a prostration of forgetfulness. So if somebody comes to the mosque late, he knows he has to make up cycles, but because he's come late, say he's come at the last and final sitting, he doesn't know if the imam has done a mistake that he needs to rectify, right? Because he got there right at the end. In this situation, not to be hasty, the minute the imam says salam, you rise to complete what you've missed. No, to wait till the imam has done the first salam and the second salam, then you know, oh, the imam isn't doing 2 prostrations. So in this instance, then to stand, say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and then get on with your prayer. The following emphasized sunnahs are for men, while women do the opposite. So while bowing, men clutch the knees with fingers outspread wide. So when men bow, they hold on to the knees. Their fingers are wide. You do not bend your knees. You do not bend down more than your basically your head needs to be in parallel with your back. You don't bend down at an angle like this, past 90 degrees. You don't do less. Some people's natural tendency, the way their body is positioned, it will be a bit less. There's not a problem with that. But the basic idea is to get it like this. And you don't raise your head. So once you're like this, your head doesn't raise like that, but it doesn't go excessively like that. You're just looking down at your point of prostration. At your feet at that point. In prostration, men keep abdomen distance. They keep the abdomen distant from the thighs. So in prostration, there needs to be a gap for men. When they prostrate, there needs to be a gap between the abdomen and the thighs. So you're not hunching over where your thighs are now in contact with your abdomen. It needs to be a beautifully performed, well done prostration where there's a gap between your elbows. Right? For women, they cover it. For men, they leave the gap. And there's a gap between their abdomen and their thighs. And the position of the arms is they're close to the head. Spreading the arms, if you're in a tight congregation, it's not easy to do this. In that instance, because there's no space, you'd naturally do this. And if you were to do this, you'd cause huge inconvenience for others beside you to pray. The sitting position, iftirash for men, the sitting position is where you sit, where one leg goes like that, and then the second leg is like that. You're sitting on top of your toe, like that. It's not an easy position to sit if you're not used to sitting like that, but the more times you do it, the easier it does become. And naturally, your second foot is going to be like this, a little bit to the side, as the natural way your foot folds underneath you when you sit. So now these are the sunnahs, just a quick list, for what women do that's different than what men do. And they're taken from some famous books like Al-Hadaya Al-Ulu'iyya and Maraki Al-Falah and others. These are also books from the Hanafi school. So when performing the opening takbir, she raises her hands to the level of her shoulders up to here. So the woman doesn't do that. The woman doesn't do that. She keeps them here. It's more closer to modesty. She says Allahu Akbar, like this. When performing the opening takbir, she does not withdraw her hands. So as mentioned earlier, right, she doesn't do that. She doesn't do that where her skin shows. Right? She may even have to do this to cover it, right? Sometimes you see women doing this. And she should be ideally she should be wearing some clothes that don't allow for her hands to show. And there are these traditional dresses that women wear for prayer. You get these in the Middle East, and they're like a one-piece garment. It completely covers you. And in that instance, she could even wear that as an overgarment where her hands are underneath. So nobody would see her hands. And in that instance, if she said Allahu Akbar, the outer garment would be covering her, so nobody would even be able to, nobody would know what she's doing or to see any part of her body. When standing, she places her right inner palm on top of her left hand and rests them on her chest, as we mentioned, without clasping them. So there's no clasping like this. It's just a resting on the chest. While men place their hands below their navel, as mentioned. When bowing, she bends her back slightly so that she touches her knees, but she does not straighten her back fully. So as we mentioned, a man goes into a 90 degree like this. Right? A woman doesn't do that. She only goes here. When her arms get to, and her hands can touch her knees, that's where she stops. And it's actually, it's like this. Right? It's closer to modesty for a woman. When bowing, she does not spread her fingers apart, unlike men. And when bowing, she places her palms upon her knees and does not grasp her knees. So when men spread their fingers and they hold on to their knees, right? So if a man has done this, he holds on to his knees without due force. He holds on to, or pressure. The knees are not taking his full weight pressure. He's supporting himself, but his hands are holding on to the knees. Whereas with women, they keep them like this. When bowing, she bends her knees, unlike men who keep their knees straightened. Also, if a woman bends her knees, she'll get her hands to her knees quicker than if she were standing straight-legged. So because she needs to only bend slightly, right? She bends, and as she bends her knees, she only needs to literally bend kind of this much for her hands to touch her knees, right? Whereas men keep their legs locked and straight, and they have to bend at a 40-degree angle. So a woman doesn't need to do this. When bowing and prostrating, she keeps her underarms from her shoulders. So again, in the bowing position, the way men bow, if at a 45-degree angle, there's going to be a gap between the arms and the sides of the body. But the way a woman bows, with her legs bent, her elbows are going to be in, and she's going to be touching her knees. It's a more modest position for women. And when she goes into sujood, again, she doesn't do this. She rests her arms on the ground, close to her body, and there's no gap. Her belly touches her thighs, so there's no gap. For her, it's closer to modesty. She rests her foreheads on the ground. She does not keep her toes upright like men. Men have to keep their toes upright like this. A woman doesn't do that. While sitting for tashahhud, she sits in the warrak position. She places hands on top of her thighs. So this is the way that women sit during prayer, which is different than men. This position is where she folds her legs. She'll fold her legs underneath her body, and she'll sit on her left buttock. She'd sit on her left buttock with her legs folded out, and one of her feet will be protruding out like this. And that's it's a more modest position for a woman to sit. And ideally, she'd be wearing something long that would cover her feet as well when she's sitting like this. Again, when she sits for tashahhud, the last sitting, or the second sitting in a 4-cycle prayer, she doesn't spread her fingers on her legs, on her thighs. Rather, she keeps them closed. If the imam forgets something in his prayer, so if she's in congregation and she's the only one that realizes that the imam has forgotten something or made a mistake, she doesn't say subhanallah or try to draw the attention of the imam by correcting him. She will clap her hands. Right? She'll make a sound like this to draw attention to the imam that he's made a mistake. Women do not lead men in prayer, and it's makruh, it's sinful, it's makruh tahriman for a woman to be leading a congregation, even of women. Right? Women do not lead congregations. They don't give the adhan and they don't give the iqamah. If she prays in a mixed congregation, she stands behind the men. If she is not obliged to attend the Friday prayer, but if she does and complete it, it counts as her dhuhr prayer. It is not necessary for her to attend the Eid prayers as opposed to men. It is not recommended for her to wait until the brightness of the sun to pray Fajr. So men, we pray Fajr towards the end of the time, whereas a woman prays in the early time. Because the earliest time to pray is the best time for all of the prayers. The minute the adhan is given, that's the earliest of the window of the prayer time you have, and it's best for everybody, whether if a person's praying in the house, to pray them at the right time. But obviously for men, like for Fajr, you delay the Fajr. She does not recite out loud in the non-silent prayers, yet it is important to note that if she's praying by herself in any prayer, she must recite at the level. So what it means here for a woman to not recite loudly is that in the silent prayers, which are the Dhuhr, the Asr prayers, a man is silent and a woman is silent. In the other prayers, not to recite loudly that somebody would hear her. She would recite where she could hear herself, but not to recite loudly where a man could hear her. So now we're going to look at some of the etiquettes of the prayer. This is like the cherry on top of the cake. If the icing is the sunnah as a metaphor, and then the cherry on top of the cake, the final touches that will beautify your prayer, are some of the etiquettes. And amongst the etiquettes of the ritual prayer are the following, which again means that our authors only picked a few here. There are more than this in the books. For the man to take his hands out of his sleeves when performing the tahrima. So again, as mentioned, right, if you've got sleeves that cover you long like this, like long sleeves, then you wouldn't keep your hands covered and then say the Allahu Akbar. Naturally when you do this, the garment would go back, and you'd let it go back. And even when you're here, you don't cover yourself up again and then start the prayer. No, naturally once they're here, they're here. The thing is, when you say the tahrima and say Allahu Akbar, you're not putting your hands down to the bottom and then doing this. It's from here and it's here. So your sleeves would stay where they are, and you wouldn't be fiddling with them, putting them back just because they're long. Obviously, women wouldn't do this, as discussed. To direct one's glance towards the place of prostration when standing. So when you're standing, you're looking at the place you're going to be bowing at. You're not looking here and there. The tops of one's feet when bowing, the tip of one's nose when prostrating. So when you prostrate, you're trying to look. Now this basically means you're looking in that general area, right? It's impossible for you to cross your eyes to the extent that you're looking here. But it basically means that you're looking in that general area when you're prostrating. So you're not looking ahead of you, not looking at the carpet here or the carpet there. You're looking at this area here. The lap when sitting. So when you're sitting in the julus position, you're looking at your legs. And each shoulder when making the closing salam. So you look here. You don't do this, or as some people do this and then do that. No, you pray and then you look. Sometimes people do this. They give a salam like this. No, from here you just look here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And that's it. It's done. Closing your eyes. Now generally closing eyes is disliked. But unless there's a genuine need, some people genuinely find it more, they can concentrate more, they're more focused, they're more in the zone when they're not distracted by any visual cue, any light, any pattern on the carpet or anything like that. They can genuinely concentrate more. So if it aids you in concentration, it's okay. But as a general rule, it's something that's disliked because it could entail slight laziness or a lack of concentration in itself also. But if it aids you in concentration, and this you genuinely aids you in concentration, then it's allowed. To try one's best to prevent oneself from coughing. Coughing can be problematic. If you're a habitual cougher who's just has the habit of coughing in prayer can be problematic, because coughing it can sound like a sound, like a or something like that. And that's a letter, right? That's a word. So depending on what you've done, you could invalidate your prayer. So if you're a habitual cougher, you shouldn't cough. If it's a need, you need to clear your throat, or you've got a tickle in your cough, or you just have to cough for some reason, then that's excused. But someone who coughs without a reason, just for the sake of coughing, it could invalidate your prayer. And yawning, try not to yawn. Try not to yawn, it's from the devil. And if you must yawn, to discreetly use the back of your hand, or to use the sleeve without too many movements. And that's it for today. Next lesson, inshallah, we're going to have a look at the disliked actions of prayer. Thank you very much. That's it for today. Thank you very much.